Hi everyone, Morpp here, and in case you weren't aware, a week ago as of the timing of recording this video, I placed second in Goat Format Championship 23, which qualifies me for the 2025 Goat Format World Championship. Since then, I've been getting a lot of questions about the Mythical 2.0 Chaos Turbo deck list that I played in that event, and so I figured I'd make this video to kind of go over a lot of those frequently asked questions and also explain my thought process on the deck and the card choices of that deck. So yeah, without further ado, let's just get right into it. So here's the deck list. You'll notice it's just very stock Chaos Turbo for the most part. I kind of pride myself in playing no nonsense deck lists like this, and what you see here clearly reflects that. This list is actually built upon a list of Chaos Turbo, or a build of Chaos Turbo called the Mythical Chaos Turbo list. This was created during Goat Format World League Season 4 by Team Solly. Key members of that being Nicey and Ivan Rosito and Flocky. So yeah, and the reason that I call it Mythical 2.0 is because the original Mythical list has a second Mind Control and a Swords of Revealing Light over a Zora Priest and Mystic Walk in the sideboard. You can play those cards, but later on in the video I'll go over why I chose to play Azura and Mystic Walk. Otherwise, the entire deck is just basically what is dubbed Mythical Turbo. And yeah, it's a very good list in my opinion, and I would recommend it if you wanted to pick up Chaos Turbo going forward. Now, in regards to specific card choices, let's talk about Dekoichi and Jar Agreed and the ratios I played of these first. So, Dekoichi is a 14-10 threat. This is actually really relevant because against the Panda Bird matchup, you're going to be boarding out your Gravekeeper Spies, and when you do so, you may find yourself lacking a density of darks. And so for that reason, you do want a critical mass of darks to enable your chaos plays, even after you side some out. Unfortunately, the card is a liability against Blade Knight and Mystic Swordsman level 2 out of Warriors. You'll notice that in the sideboard, we have 3 Zabara of the Dark. These are mainly there to kind of swap out 1-for-1 with the Dekoichis. Because in the same way that the coach is going to let you stabilize very early on against most decks not named Warrior, Zambara is going to be doing that against Warrior for you. You also don't need to worry about Zambara actually hitting the graveyard, because as soon as this kills something and drops down to 1900 attack, your opponent will just summon a Blade Knight or like their own Zambara and then just run over it. So in that sense, it does actually hit the bin quite reliably. Which is actually very good and also very relevant and important. Unfortunately, it is also a normal summon or set, and we want around 16 of those in the deck. Chaos Turbo does have a issue sometimes of just drawing too many monsters. But even with that said, I do think, you do need like a critical mass of them to be able to basically have functional hands. Now, why is the number 16? Well, the number is 16 because, and I'll try and explain this as concisely as I possibly can. We want around 40% of the deck to be normal summons. Now, why is it 40%? It's 40% because when you play Magic, mainly Standard and Pioneer, less so Modern and Legacy, you have around, I'd say, like 24 to 25 lands on average in your 60-card deck, which is equivalent to around 40% of the deck. If we port that over to GOAT format, I feel like your normal summon count is very similar to your land count, where you want enough of them to ensure that you have proactive plays at your disposal every turn, but also not too many of them to where you are just kind of flooded on monsters. Now, if you look at the Chaos Turbo deck from before, or the list that I posted kind of earlier in this video that I showed off, you'll notice that the deck actually plays 21 monsters, which is, not 60 normal summons. So, like, what is up with that? Well, you play 3 Chaos monsters in 1 BLS and 2 Sork. Those are strictly special summons, which don't really count. So let's bring that number down to 18 first, all things considered. Then we also need to notice that Serpent, Thunder Dragon, and Night Assailant are also not strict normal summons. They probably count towards like maybe let's say like half a normal summon each. Um, because you're going to be discarding them a lot. To Tribe Infecting Virus, Graceful Charity, Regeki Break, etc. And for that reason, you actually only really play around like 15 normal summons if you consider the 6 discard fodder cards that I mentioned earlier as half normal summon each. So for that reason, like, yes, even though on paper it looks like, we're playing a lot of monsters and we might actually brick on monsters, we're actually only playing around 14 to 15 normal summons in your deck, which is kind of where you want to be. The warrior deck, if you count Rhoda, also plays this amount, and I believe that, that's kind of the right number, and I think that's kind of where you want to be. Now, Jar of Greed. Jar of Greed is an acceptable card against Warrior, unlike Dekoichi, because, obviously Jar of Greed is not a monster. It can't be run over by Blade Knight and Mystic Level Swordsman level 2 for no effect. So in that sense, against the Warrior matchup, it does have a bit of a higher power floor. But unfortunately, the card is not a threat, obviously, because it's not a monster and it can't attack for damage, yada yada. And the main thing is that Jar of Greed drawing Jar of Greed is very slow and tempo negative. You kind of want your slow cantrip like Jar of Greed to not really draw another one, because then you have to spend another turn to set the Jar of Greed and then like activate it again just to get your real card. And so for that reason, I believe that the correct ratio of both of these cards is 3 and 2. You want to play 3 Deco because, the Decos are threats, and then you want to play 2 Jar of Greed to reduce the risk of you drawing Jar of Greed off of Jar of Greed. I feel quite strongly about this, honestly. There are going to be situations where you might want to swap the ratios. For example, let's say like you're playing in a metagame where there are a ton of warrior pilots. Maybe you would want to swap to 2 Dekoichi and 3 Jar of Greed so that, you're not just giving your opponent things to run over with their Blade Knights and their Swordsman level 2s. But in general, and I think definitely for an open metagame, the correct ratio is 3 and 2. Now let's talk about Night Assailant. Some people have really recently cut this card from their deck, and I don't really understand why. This card is absolutely insane. I'm going to try and explain why. So, it's a searchable answer to Chaos Sorcerer in the mirror, and allows you to deny enemy flips if you're ahead on board. This is actually really relevant because a lot of the times, let's say like you resolve a spy, and then you nobleman your opponent's like first set monster. Let's say like you're on the play and you just managed to do that. Now all of a sudden you're really ahead, but you also, like, if your nobleman didn't hit their spy, if they draw their spy and you don't have another answer to it, like, you just get walled out for no reason. Having Night Assailant in that spot is, I think, really cool. Because it just basically allows you to stay aggressive and to kind of keep snowballing your advantage by denying your opponent the resources to stop you, and or just, preventing them from drawing extra cards off of Dekoichi or recurring a power spell with Fae or something like that to kind of claw back into the game. Night Assailant is also really necessary to fuel the 3rd discard trap in the sideboard. If you don't play Night Assailant, you can't really afford to play the 3rd discard trap because you just won't reliably have enough fodder to fuel it. And so for that reason, I think this card is actually really important and very mandatory to play in the deck. It's also very insane against Burn as an additional answer to set monsters such as Daze Koala, Big Shield Gardna, and both Sideboard and Morphing Jar. When you don't have Night Assailant, Daze Koala and Big Shield Gardna can be really annoying because your monsters just naturally don't attack through them unless they're, exactly like a Pumped Breaker or like BLS or Sork. So in that sense, like, being able to pop their walls, I think, is actually really important and very relevant. And basically just any way to insulate yourself from Cyber and Morphing Jar is also just great, right? So that's a big thing. So yeah, I definitely think you should play 2. It should not be a debate. It's funny because I actually used to really dislike this card. I just thought like both the Man-Eater bug-like effect and the discard effect were A, not really all that important, and B, just like very win more. But having played with the card now, and also having played so long without it, I definitely think that you should be playing it, and it's like not close. Ever since I put Night Assailant in my deck, like, my win rate against burn has, I think, increased, like, tremendously. And it's definitely one of, like, your best cards against burn in that sense. So, yeah, play 2. Some people play 1. I also think that's really weird because at that point, you're not really tapping into the strength of the card, which is, like, being able to loop itself. So, if you have one Night Assailant in your graveyard and one in your hand, you just basically get to fuel all of your discard outlets for free until you decide to break it, and then like start to break the loop, and then like pick up like a Dekoichi or a Faith or whatever to like keep your advantage train rolling. Now let's talk about Trap Dustshoot and Solemn Judgment. I think there's a very common misconception about these cards where you are forced to basically play one or the other, and I think it's just very not true. The presence of one does not mean the absence of the other. You can main deck both, and we see this in Scrub for Life's top 4 list in that same tournament where he is playing 2 Solemn and 2 Dustshoot. Now, you can do this. I just want to be very clear. You can do this. I don't think you should, but you can, should you want to do so for whatever reason. In this case, this is a Scrub list is also Ivan's list, and Ivan is kind of my coach. So when we were preparing for this tournament, his idea was to play Solemn in the main deck to hedge for the warrior matchup a bit more. And he told me to do the same thing as well. Unfortunately, I decided not to because I didn't feel like Solemn moved the needle enough game 1 against warrior to be worth it. And I do think Solemn makes your mirror match up a lot worse. And I'll explain why I think that in a little bit. But yeah, point being, if you want to main both, you can main both. I just wanted to really hammer that home because I think it's a very common misconception that people have, and it's just very not true. So first, let's talk about Dustshoot. In my opinion, if you're going to play any at all, you should probably be playing 3, and here's why. The card is the strongest in the opening hand. And to maximize its strength, you should be playing the maximum number of copies possible to ensure that you open it as much as possible. In this case, we can only play 3 Dustshoot in the main deck, so we should be playing 3. Now, obviously, this is different if there was, like, no limit to how many copies of the same named card that you could play in a deck, but again, that's all hypothetical. We can only play 3. We should probably be playing 3 so that we maximize the odds of drawing it and thus drawing the card when it's at its most potent. Playing less than 3 copies is not going to change the fact that you will brick on it at some point in the mid game. And so when I see lists like playing 2 because they're like, oh, I want to open it, but I don't want to draw it late. I think they're just kind of missing the point of why the card is so good. Again, Dustshoot is at its most potent when you open it. It's not necessarily dead in the mirror when you draw it late. It can be, but it can still be live, right? And your deck is also playing like Tribe, Grace, Break. So if you do draw it late, you can just discard it to those cards. For that reason, I definitely think you should be playing 3. Very similarly to the Night Assailant debate, it should not be close. Yeah, if we're gonna play any at all, I would definitely play 3. Now let's talk about Solemn. So earlier I was saying how I wasn't a fan of Solemn in the mirror. The reason I'm not a fan of it is because it goes against this play pattern where you usually take a hit, let's say from something like Breaker or Tribe, Resolve Dekoichi, Spy Bodies, whatever, and then you immediately drop Chaos or you drop Tribe or you snatch their dude with Snatch, and then you just immediately stabilize. This is a play pattern that's extremely common, and when you kind of like lack the life points to be able to do so, that's obviously a very big issue. Because like all of a sudden, because you use Solemn for whatever reason, you can no longer take the same hits that you otherwise would be able to take and then just retaliate and stabilize immediately. Now Solemn's a very important card in the sideboard for warrior, because you're a lot better fighting off the Solemn War than not fighting it at all. It's also very important against the Scapegoat plus Metamorphosis control decks like Chaos Control and Goat Control, because you need ways to stop Scapegoat and or if they resolve Scapegoat, you need ways to stop their metamorphosis, you need ways to stop the creature swap. And you also just want Solemn as a way to kind of like force your aggressive pushes through Scapegoat, buying them like an extra turn. A lot of the Chaos Control decks also are playing Solemns themselves, so again, fighting the Solemn War is way better than not fighting it. And obviously, it's also just very good against most combo decks. Think Reasoning Gate Turbo, the rare Empty Jar, the rare Library, etc. Unfortunately, it's not very good against Rescue Cat because most cat decks do play burn cards in the sideboard. Sorry, not in the sideboard. They play burn cards in general, so you don't really want it there. But like, it basically is great against most matchups that are not exactly the mirror, and so for that reason, I think you definitely should be playing some number of it. Yeah. Finally, I just wanted to talk about the side deck a little bit, and talk about some notable omissions from the deck that some people may have noticed as well. So, Azura Priest. This is a card that, honestly, I could see myself cutting in the future, but in the meantime, and just for now, it's a card that I'm quite fond of. It's quite good against Chaos Control because they basically, like, can't use Tur on it to remove it. They can't use Swap on it, which is great. And there's also a thing, or like a play pattern that happens occasionally in the control mirrors where you both kind of just sit there and do nothing because any threat you commit, they're just going to steal. So you just kind of sit there and do nothing, and then you try and like OTK them with this combination of like Heavy Storm plus a way to clear scapegoats. Usually that's Tribe Infected Virus plus like some amount of Chaos as like a special summon and like as a way to push extra damage through. Azura kind of adds a bit of redundancy there because now instead of needing exactly Heavy plus Tribe plus BLS or Sorcerer, you need Heavy plus Tribe or Azura plus BLS or Sorcerer, right? So, for that reason, I quite like the card. I also like it against Reasoning Gate Turbo because, very similarly to the Chaos Control matchup, you do need ways to push through Scapegoat. In that matchup, obviously, like, if you leave them with tokens, they just get to use the tokens to fuel Monster Gate, which is not necessarily ideal. So, yeah. With that said, I did play against, I think, Chaos Control twice in this tournament, and I played against Go Control once, and I don't think I needed Azura to beat or to win any of those rounds. So I could see myself cutting it going forward. It being a spirit is actually a little bit awkward too because you're not sticking threats on the board. And if for whatever reason like you want to cut the card because there's no control players in your local metagame or there's no Reasoning Gate Turbo players in your local metagame, by all means go ahead and do so. If you're going to do so, personally I would play a second Mind Control. Mystic Walk. Some people don't actually like this card very much. I think the first copy is really good because Panda Bird is not really going to be interacting with you very much. So a lot of times, like, you'll resolve a Dekoichi, and then, like, you just won't have a way to, like, put a Dark in the graveyard because you boarded out your spies, and, like, you don't want to commit extra monsters to pressure them because, you're scared of Ojometrio locking you. And so for that reason, like, having, like, a fourth tribute, the other three tributes obviously being Thunder Dragon, in that sense, to just be able to yard your Darks more proactively is, I think, quite nice. Obviously, unlocking yourself from Trio is also very nice, and having some insulation against their like True Nade into like chain a bunch of burn traps plan against you is also very good. I don't think you need more than one because the card is very narrow in its application, and if you ever need the second, you can just pick it back up off of Faith. But I do think the first copy is warranted and it's quite good. If you want an extra card for the Warrior matchup, you can try cutting Walk. Swords does also slot into this quite well. By that I mean like it slots fine against Panda Burn. But I'm quite a big fan of Walk. And also, again, if there's just like no burn players in your local metagame, by all means, you can cut the Walk. Either for like Mind Control or Swords, as is the Mythical list. Finally, let's go over some notable omissions. The first one being Kaiku. I am not really a huge fan of this card. A lot of cards in the deck, let's say like, a lot of cards in the Chaos Turbo deck, which you're going to be bringing this in, mainly for the mirrors and stuff. naturally either just like removes or like stalls out a Kaiku. So like Spy, Tsukiyomi, Night Assailant, Sangan to find one of those three cards, um, Snatch, Ring, Mirror Force, Regeki Break, Torrential, if some players play it. More on that later, by the way. It's just not very good, and quite frankly, like the deck doesn't fold to a singular Kaiku. Sometimes Kaiku can run away with the game if it just, goes unanswered for like a super duper long period of time, but I find that very unlikely, and it's also just really embarrassing if Kaiku ever runs into your opponent's Gravekeeper Spies, because then your only like efficient way of like clearing the spies is to, well, efficient being like a one turn way to clear both spies is the Tribe Infecting Virus, and then when you like go Tribe Call Spellcaster to kill their spies, you also lose your Kaiku in the process. So that's a big issue with the card. I've never really liked it. If this is just like a lot of turbo in your local metagame, by all means you can, or you just kind of like want a bit more of an edge against the mirror, but it's not a card that's ever impressed me very much. It dies to a lot of things, which is, I think, like not ideal, and quite frankly, it will very rarely win the game on its own. That's its biggest issue. I would rather just like board in mind controls and kind of call it a day. Oh, there's one other point I'll also bring up. What are you boarding out for like this card, right? Like if you're boarding out like Dekoichis to keep your normal summon count and to keep your monster count identical, pre-board and post-board, that's fine. But then all of a sudden you're just lacking ways to generate card advantage or lacking ways to dig through your deck. And if your opponent's going to be digging through your deck faster than you because you're boarding out cantrips for Kaikus, like that's not really ideal, right? So yeah, not really a huge fan. Card's fine. I could see myself playing it, if I don't know, the entire tournament field was like Chaos Turbo, but because you have to kind of keep yourself honest in open metagames like the GFC, it's not a card I'm interested in, unfortunately. Rose Revealing Light. So I've never liked this card either. I think its biggest issue is that it just kind of delays the inevitable, and it doesn't really answer any of the threats that you are preventing from attacking you. Like after Swords dies, right? You still have to like find a way to deal with whatever you were floodgating from attacking you. And I think that's a big issue. Like if you just like, I don't know, draw 3 useless cards, or like you just don't draw like answers, in the turns that Swords is giving you, it's just really useless. And also your opponent is going up 3 cards too. So like, you're losing Swords, you're both basically drawing 3 cards or whatever, during the time period that Swords is granting you, like, that reprieve, and then, you're basically just back in, like, the exact same game state that you were in, except, all of a sudden now your Swords is gone. The card's really nice, to basically force Faith Resolutions through, like, Blade Knight and Mystic Swords on level 2. But I mean, Exiled Force is still a card, and that's really like the only thing that's good for. When you're boarding out the Koichis against Warrior, you know, there's not really like an additional flip that you're trying to resolve really badly, and obviously like Spy just naturally just blanks Blade Knight, and like Blade Knight just bounces off of it. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of it. If you just want an 11th card to make your fates a little bit better, against Warrior, because obviously it's a spell you can recur with Faith, by all means you can play this. But I just don't really see what it's accomplishing a lot of the time, and I would rather, diversify my sideboard a little bit for other matchups. And the final notable omission I want to talk about is Torrential Tribute. This is a card that even the Mythical list doesn't play, and the reason it doesn't play it is because Turbo is a deck that is basically committing monsters to the board every single turn. You're always setting monsters, you're always like looking for spots to commit like a Sork or a BLS or whatever. And anytime like you've resolved the Koichi, or like you've resolved a Spy, it's just not a card you ever really want to be using, because you're using those resolve flip monsters to be applying pressure on your opponent, and nuking the board is basically the last thing you want to be doing in those positions. It's also really awkward if you ever need to like set Torrential behind a Spy, because like, all of a sudden like, you're just losing the thing that you just set. It can be fine if, like, let's say, like, you set Spy, you set Torrential, your opponent sets a monster into you, you, like, flip summon Spy, Chain Torrential, and then, like, you wipe the board, and then you get a Spy Body out. Like, that can be okay, but the card is frankly just very awkward in a deck that's committing to the board so heavily all the time, and I haven't missed the card. I used to play it, but after cutting it and kind of just, like, examining the play patterns of Turbo, it's a card that you very much will not miss, in my opinion. And if you never tried playing Turbo without it, I highly recommend doing so, because you'll notice, like, how awkward it is and how hard it is to get mileage out of the card against skilled opponents. Like, people will just, like, not overextend into Torrential if they don't have to because they're already winning, right? They're going to make you answer their board first and then commit more threats. And then, probably, like, when you've committed a threat to deal with their existing board, now all of a sudden you just don't want to Torrential again, and it just kind of sits there and rots there, which is obviously very not ideal. So, yeah, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good day.